Hello again, everybody. Welcome back into Sports and Money with Ben Parker. Hope life is treating you well. Hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're looking at the Oakland Raiders 2019 off-season. This is mid-January of 2019. We're going to take a look at some of the things, some of the major transactions they did over the past 4 or 5 months. We're going to take a look at some of their assets as well, and then we'll stop and take a look at some of their player grades, some of the player position rankings, and see what areas they need to be looking at, working on during this off season, and maybe even during the couple of off seasons up ahead as well. Let's start with this. I've got up here on the board, and I know I've got it flooded with all kinds of stuff. We're going to work our way through it. These are all the player position grades that we've got listed here. Also, these are the assets. Now, typically for any team, any NFL team, the better your players are, that is, the better the grades are, the worse your assets are going to be. You're going to have a lower cap space if your players are better because, of course, you are having to pay those better players. Also, if you have a lot of draft picks, that probably means, in the Raiders' case, that you have traded away some star player in order to get those draft picks. So typically speaking, the better your assets are, like the Raiders now, like the Cleveland Browns last offseason, the worse your player grades are going to be, and that is exactly the case, of course, for the Raiders. Let's start with the assets. Right over here, the projected cap space for this offseason for the Raiders is $79.9 million. We'll call it an even 80. That number, of course, is going to fluctuate all through the offseason as the Raiders start to spend money. One fallacy that a lot of people fall into, even some NFL executives fall into, I think, is getting too infatuated with a lot of cap space. The NFL cap space is not as important as it is in the NBA. In the NBA, if you have a ton of cap space, you can reach out and grab 2 or 3 of the best free agents on the market, and your team can go from being the worst in basketball overnight to being the best team in basketball. We've seen that before with the Miami Heat and, of course, a couple of other teams as well trying to do that. It does not work the same way in the NFL. It's nice to have cap space, but you don't necessarily need that much. What you do need in the NFL is cap flexibility. The reason for that is, even if you have a ton of cap space, like the Raiders do, like the New York Jets do, if you were to spend all of that money on the best free agents on the market for that offseason, your team is not automatically going to become a super team overnight. In fact, as those contracts get larger, you're actually going to have to shed some of the other contracts in the coming seasons. It's nice to have this much cap space, but you don't need it. If you've got about $40–45 million every year, $30–40 million every season, that is really the ideal spot to be. It shows that you're rotating players in and out. You're being responsible physically. You're not just letting go of a bunch of good players all at once, nor are you signing a bunch of good players all at once in an effort to get better overnight. A lot of times when you see some of these teams bring in a lot of free agents at decent dollar prices overnight, they just don't really respond that well and work together that well. I think you're seeing some of that with the Los Angeles Rams this year on defense. I think you're seeing some of that effect this year, where even if you do bring in some really good players, sometimes they just don't cooperate and work together as well as they should, especially in year one. So this is awesome. It's wonderful to have $80 million in cap space. The Raiders are going to use every penny of it, of course, but you don't necessarily need that much if you're an NFL team. They do have it, however. They also have in draft picks. They are loaded for the next 2 seasons. We all know why. They got rid of Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper. We'll look at those couple of trades here in a couple of minutes. Whatever you think about the Mack and Cooper deals, and I like one, I don't like the other, whatever you think about those deals, the result is they have a boatload of draft picks for the next 2 off seasons. During this offseason, they have 3 number 1s, they have a number 2, and a number 3. So they have 5 of the top 100 players, basically, that they get to pick from. They also have, during the following offseason, they have 4 of the top 100 with 2 number 1s, a number 2, and a number 3. Not all of those are their picks. Some of them are 2s and 3s or 1s from, say, Chicago or the Dallas Cowboys, but they are loaded. So for the next 2 years, they have 9 of the top 100 draft picks, of the top 200 draft picks is what they have. So they have a chance here, as expected, as designed. They have a chance to try to build back up with the cap space and the draft picks. So that's their assets. The result of having all these assets, though, is, of course, as you already know if you're a Raiders fan, your football team isn't very good, and it wasn't this past year. It was terrible. It was a disaster. Not telling you anything you don't already know. I'm certainly not trying to run down your team, but you know that your team had a lot of troubles this year. We're going to go group by group with each of these and take a look at each of the positions. Now, some of you have already been looking at these grades while I've been talking, and you've been looking at some of them and said, Ben, you're an idiot. These grades are all wrong. These grades focus on two things. Number one, of course, how they played last season. But they also take into account the players that you have coming back next year. And that is two things. If you have rookies who looked solid at a position during 2018, and you think that they're going to take a step up, I tried to account that in here for one. Also, guys that were injured, we'll see that in a minute. If you know you had those guys coming back and you're expecting some really positive production from those guys next year, I put that back in. So this is a reflection not necessarily of how everybody performed in 2018. It's a reflection of how each group looks right now with all the players that you have on the roster, the injured guys and the rookies who you expect to develop as well. That is what we tried to put together here. These player grades, these groupings, if you think they're stupid after I'm done explaining them to you, then by all means let me know. In general though, this is to give you an idea, a flash idea. Here's a group. Here's whether or not we need to do major upgrades or whether or not we can get by for this next season is what we're trying to look at. Let's start off with quarterback. Derek Carr, I gave him a B-. I didn't really factor in the backups too much. Derek Carr, he is what he is. He is a guy who can pass for a lot of yardage, a lot of first downs. He is going to give your team a chance to win if you put a decent roster around him. He is not necessarily a guy who is going to lead your team to more wins than the roster deserves. Tom Brady can do that. I think Drew Brees can do that. There are a couple of other quarterbacks who can do that in certain years. Derek Carr is not that elite kind of a quarterback. He's also not the worst. He is a middle-of-the-pack quarterback, and that's what he is, and as long as he's healthy, that's what he will remain to be for the next 2 or 3 seasons, whether he's with the Raiders or whether John Gruden jettisons him for somebody else to some other team. That's what Derek Carr is. So I gave him a B-. He's a middle-of-the-pack quarterback. He's solid. If you put pieces around him, he can win. He can take you a long ways if you put a good roster around him. So we gave him a B-. The offensive line, listen, the offensive line in 2018 was a disaster. It was terrible in every part, every facet, every single game just about. The offensive line was horrible. Now, why'd you give them a B, Ben? Because they have a couple of major injuries with Penn and with Gabe Jackson as well. I think if you had those two guys all season long and they were healthy, I think this offensive line would have been solid. So the state of the offensive line, looking at next year, looking at hopefully, listen, the couple of rookies you had on offensive line this year couldn't have been much worse than they were. So they've got to get a little bit better. They really shouldn't have been starting at all this season. They just had to do it because of the injuries. So I think with what you have coming back, offensive line, I think you're solid. I think you would have been solid this season. I think you were solid next season with what you have coming back. Moving to the wide receivers, listen, if Amari Cooper had been here, that would have been a B. You take Cooper out, they were a D. Not very good. All right, the tight ends are actually pretty solid. You don't have to worry about the tight ends. They're decent. They're quality starters. You can play with the tight ends that you have. The wide receiver period, though, is just really bad. They need to upgrade there, of course, and they know that. When they let go of Amari Cooper, they knew that they were downgrading the wide receiver position by a tremendous amount. The running backs, there is nothing to write home at about the running backs. They're not great. They're not bad. Had you had Marshawn Lynch there, they might have been a little bit better, but listen, Marshawn Lynch is not going to be the Marshawn Lynch that he used to be. Can he still produce? I think so. Can he still offer some things for this offense? I think so. Can he still be, at least at times, a flash of what he used to be? I think so, but Marshawn Lynch is not going to be the guy that you saw in Seattle 3 or 4 seasons ago. The running backs are decent. It's not a terribly important position the way the NFL is structured right now. So heading into this offseason, I don't think you necessarily need to worry about upgrading the running back position unless the opportunity just presents itself. Moving to the defense, the secondary was a disaster. I think a big reason for that was the pass rush was a disaster. We'll get more to the pass rush a little bit later. But for the secondary, the safeties, just like the tight end starters, the safety starters are actually pretty decent. And I'm not getting into all the names today. I don't have time to do that. I'm just giving you a general overview. Your safeties are actually pretty decent. You don't have to worry about them moving forward. You can kind of count on getting some decent, solid, quality starter production out of them. You don't have holes in the safety position. The cornerbacks, however, were a disaster all the way through, just about all year long. cornerback needs major upgrades going forward. That's something I would really look at the Raiders doing maybe this offseason somehow, either the free agency or the draft. The defensive interior, you've got a couple of young guys in there with Hurst and Hall that I think you can grow with. I gave them a C, even though they were not that great this year. They were solid, and I think moving forward you can actually see that number grow to maybe a B this next year, even if you don't address it at all this offseason. I think there's some hope there on the defensive line interior. I think those guys, if they can continue to develop, there's no reason they shouldn't. I think you're going to be solid there on the defensive interior. When you move to the linebacker position, however, the linebackers were awful. No surprise there. The edge rushing, I put that in a whole different category by itself. The getting pressure on the quarterback, whether that's the outside linebacker spot or the defensive end positions. The edge rushing was a disaster. Now you say, Ben, we all know that, and we all know why. Because Khalil Mack was traded away right before the season started, and as I think more than one analyst said to John Gruden, don't complain about the pass rush if you're going to trade away the best pass rusher in the game in Khalil Mack. But I have a different viewpoint on that, and here it is. We all knew that they were not going to be the same pass rush team without Khalil Mack. That goes without saying, we know that. But for them to have, they had 13 sacks all season long. That's just a number. It doesn't mean anything until you compare it to the second worst team in the NFL. The second worst team in the NFL this past season had 30 sacks. The Raiders had 13. Listen, there were a lot of teams in the NFL who did not have a Khalil Mack. Matter of fact, there were a lot of teams in the NFL who didn't have anybody even close to being the edge rusher that Khalil Mack was. Every one of those teams managed to at least average about 2 sacks a game, to at least get 30 sacks on the whole season. That was the next worst team in the entire league. The Raiders managed to get 13 sacks. And the reason that bothers me is from a schematic standpoint. If you know halfway through the season, you know that you don't have Khalil Mack, and you know you're not generating a pass rush, schematically, I would like to see from the coaching staff something that would get some pressure on the quarterbacks and relieve the pressure that is getting put on your cornerbacks and that is getting put on your linebackers, and that just did not happen this year. And that's the one thing I see out of this coaching staff during this one season that actually specifically bothers me from a schematic standpoint, is they did nothing to generate a pass rush of any sort, whether it was through extra blitzers or through whatever. They did absolutely nothing that worked to try to get that pass rush. That's not just the absence of Khalil Mack. You've got players on that team, even if you know that they're not going to be very good at generating a pass rush, you have got to find a way. I don't care how, but schematically you've got to find a way to come up with more than 13 sacks on the whole season when the second worst team in the NFL had 30 to 13. That does not count the leaders. The leaders were way up there around 50 sacks on the season. That was the second worst team. That is really horrible. That's something that I think really going forward the coaching staff hopefully can figure out a way to evolve, even if they don't happen to get a great pass rusher in this year's draft or in this year's free agent class. All right, so those are the grades. Listen, if you look at that and say, hey man, you're totally wrong with Derek Carr, that's fine. Feel free to hedge on me there. But just in general, this is an overview of the areas of the team that you really need to work on badly, and others that you're okay on or that you are just fine on going forward. So we looked at their assets, we looked at the player grades. I want to just very briefly and quickly, and thank you for hanging on. I know this is a little bit of a longer video. I want to go through some of the transactions. And we're going to start with the one that is a hot button issue for a lot of you, getting rid of Khalil Mack. This is a trade that got John Gruden in hot water very quickly with the fan base and with the national media and with pretty much anybody who didn't like him in the first place, and with some people who were on the fence about him. They looked at this Khalil Mack deal, and listen, a lot of the talking heads, and by that I mean the TV broadcast crews who were doing some of the Raiders and Bears games, by that I mean the talk radio people who come on Monday through Friday and even on the weekends to talk about these trades, a lot of them completely blasted John Gruden for getting rid of Khalil Mack. The idea being this: Khalil Mack is possibly, if not the best defensive player in the game, then he's one of the 2 or 3 best defensive players in the game. He is insane. He generates an amazing pass rush. He is tracking, I don't want to get the cart before the horse, he is tracking toward a Hall of Fame career if he keeps on the way he is. He's an insane player. Why would you not keep him? Why not find a way to get him the money? Just find a way. I heard more than one announcer talk about this specifically, and they compared it to this. If the Rams can sign Aaron Donald, then you can sign Khalil Mack. Just find a way to get it done. Those are the thoughts being echoed. If the Bears can sign Khalil Mack, then the Raiders can sign Khalil Mack. And here's what you need to remember in all of this. The Khalil Mack deal was all about money. It was completely about money. Khalil Mack, in the upcoming seasons, is going to be averaging $20 million a season. That's quarterback money. That's on the low end of quarterback money, but that is quarterback money. That is going to occupy anywhere from 11% to 13 or 14% of the overall salary cap. That is a major hit. Now, had the Raiders signed him, and this is one thing to remember with any player, even quarterbacks. I'm not going to get into quarterbacks much today and quarterback money, but this is the big thing to remember with any player that you sign to quarterback money, whether it's a quarterback or a defensive player like an edge rusher or cornerback or whatever, offensive lineman. The very instant that you give them 11, 12, 13% of your overall salary cap, you have automatically handicapped yourself going forward. You have increased your degree of difficulty for winning. Basically, that $20 million will get you at least two very, very good starters from the NFL. And I'm not talking about guys on their rookie contracts. I'm talking about guys who have moved on to their second contract. They're making significant free agent money. You can get at least two quality starters, in some cases 2.5 quality starters. So the very second that you sign a guy like Khalil Mack to $20 million a year, you are going to have to, if not this offseason, then the next offseason, you're going to have to shed about $2 to $2.5 million worth of cap, two to 2.5 players, 2.5 starters. I'm sorry for all the confusion there. About 2 starters to 2.5 starters who are making that money because there's simply not room. Now, the obvious thing is, hey, we're going to draft our way out of that. We're going to sign Khalil Mack to this money, and then we're going to draft our way out of that. Listen, nobody else in the NFL is doing that. If you can't draft any better with Khalil Mack, you're not all of a sudden going to get better at drafting once you sign Khalil Mack to all that money. All right, it's just not going to happen. Well, we're going to coach our way out of this. If you sign Khalil Mack to $20 million a year, you're not all of a sudden going to get better at coaching. For the people who think, and listen, this is a hot button issue, I understand that. For the people who think, well, the Bears all of a sudden got better with Khalil Mack, 2 things to remember. Number one is Khalil Mack only made $14 million this season. Because he was still in his 5th-year option of his rookie deal. Next year, that money goes up. Instead of making $14 million this season, he is going to be making about $22, $23 million. So the Bears are automatically going to have to get rid of somebody off their starting lineup next season in order to make sure that Khalil Mack gets his money. The Bears do not need to get rid of anybody off of their starting lineup. They got into the playoffs this year. They barely lost to the Eagles. They could really use an upgrade in order to get to that next elite level. Instead of an upgrade, they're going to lose a starter somewhere off the offense or the defense in order to pay Khalil Mack. The other thing to remember for those of you who think that Khalil Mack made the Bears better, and he did, there's no doubt to it. He made the Bears better. Do not forget this. He was on the Raiders for 4 seasons, and they had 1 winning season. That was 12-4. They lost to the Patriots in the title game. The rest of the seasons were all losing seasons. They were not great seasons. So for those of you, and listen, I know there's a lot of you who think that Khalil Mack was so important and integral to the Raiders winning. They had 1 winning season with him in 4 seasons. And had they signed him to $20 million a year, they're going to have to shed even more salary cap space, even more quality starters than they already did. Now, we're going to move off of that. Amari Cooper. I didn't like this deal. By the way, for Khalil Mack, they at least got 2 number 1s. So there's good value there. If you wait another year to trade him, you don't get the 2 number 1s. You probably get number one. Amari Cooper. I didn't like this deal when I heard it. My instinct was, wow, they let go of Amari Cooper. And here's why. And some of you were okay with it at the time or didn't like it at the time. We liked it even less when we saw what he started doing with the Dallas Cowboys. But for whatever reason, whether you did or didn't like it, The reason I would have liked to have seen them keep Amari Cooper is his basic market value is $15 million right now. Those are the estimates that when he hits, or if he were to hit the free agent market, he can make $15 million. I think for the Raiders, had they offered him a $5 or $6 million deal, I think they could have got him at about $12 or $13 million a season. I don't know that. I don't know. Maybe they'd already talked to him about that. But I think they could have gotten him for about $12 or $13 million a season, and there's good value in that for a wide receiver. He's a number one wide receiver. There's good value in $12 to $13 million. That is under that 10, 11% cap. That's a safe number. That doesn't handicap you too much. Amari Cooper would have been a good value, but they traded and let go of him at that for one spot. The key thing to remember in all of this, all of these decisions that you're seeing, Raiders fans, you already know this. Other people around the nation may not. The important thing to remember is that John Gruden has a 10-year, $100 million deal. 10 years, $100 million. He's locked in. He's here for the long haul. Whether you like his decisions or not, listen, I'm not here to tell you that he's a great coach. I'm not here to tell you that he's going to lead you to a Super Bowl. I'm not here to tell you that all his decisions are going to work and that he's going to be able to make this thing work. What I am here to tell you is his decisions were not made so you could have a good 2018. You probably won't even have a good year in 2019. I know as a fan base, that's not what anybody wants to hear. This is total rebuild. This is total tear down and rebuild. If he's making these decisions, and I'm not inside his head, so I don't know if he's crazy or not, if he's making these decisions strictly for the long haul, which he is, and he is trying to avoid major cap numbers for Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper, and he's trying to build this team closer to what the Eagles look like and the Patriots look like, and really the Bears look like as well, where the salary cap numbers are spread pretty evenly throughout the starting lineup, and you don't have 2 or 3 players getting these massive amounts of cap space. If he's trying to do that, then I really like what he's doing here, and that is the modern way to build a football team. You're trying to have as few holes on your team as you can. That is the idea on your starting lineup. Now, if all he's trying to do, and again, I'm not inside of his head, if all he's trying to do, if he's on an ego trip and he wants to tear down everything that Reggie McKenzie built for the past 6 seasons so that when this team starts winning again, John Gruden can get the credit for it and not Reggie McKenzie, then this is horrible and this is a disaster. It doesn't change the fact, though, of what these decisions were when you look at them one by one and the assets that they have because of it. The Cleveland Browns would not be where they are right now had they not decided to go this route a couple of seasons ago. The Cleveland Browns let go of Sashi Brown. They sent him packing. But Sashi Brown, with all of his assets that he collected for the Browns, is part of the reason that they were able to get Baker Mayfield. It's also part of the reason that they were able to have some hope this season moving forward. Now, Reggie McKenzie gets fired. This is a power play. There's no doubt about it. For John Gruden to come out a day later and say, this was surprising, I didn't see this coming, I didn't know this was happening, is pure baloney. Of course, the guy who's making 10 years, $100 million, of course he knew this was happening. And of course he had some input on it, and in all likelihood, this was John Gruden's call, okay? This was a power play, pure and simple, and maybe this was going to happen the very day that John Gruden showed up. Maybe this was destined to be. Reggie McKenzie didn't do anything to get fired. I want to make that clear before I move on. Reggie McKenzie had built a solid football team. This was not a Super Bowl winning team. For those of you who saw the 12-4 run a couple of seasons ago, this was not a Super Bowl winning team, okay? But this was a solid football team. This edge rushing spot would have gone back up to about a B+ probably, depending on who else was playing well. And this wide receiver spot, of course, would have gone up to a B with Amari Cooper. This was a solid football team. But this was not this was not a football team. Had they kept Reggie McKenzie, had they kept Khalil Mack, had they kept Amari Cooper, had the offensive line been healthy, this was not a football team that was going to beat the Kansas City Chiefs. It was not a football team that was going to beat the San Diego Chargers. They were fighting with the Denver Broncos for 3rd and 4th place in that division. This was a good, solid football team. Reggie McKenzie built it. Reggie McKenzie got them out of a lot of cap trouble from a few seasons ago when he first showed up. He had done a good, solid job. He's a good football guy. He's a smart guy. Reggie McKenzie didn't do anything to get fired. This was a power play. John Gruden was after 2 things when he let go of Reggie McKenzie. And here it is in Mike Mayock. This is the final thing and we're done. When you pick up Mike Mayock, and listen, I know a lot of people around the country are shaking their head again and going, oh my gosh, we got a TV guy in here. This is not a football guy. This is a TV guy. Listen, there is nothing wrong with bringing in people who aren't football guys as long as they have some common sense and they know what they are doing. Does Mike Mayock know what he's doing? I don't know. Listen, for those of you, there's a lot of people around the country who have competed with Mike Mayock in the drafting contest that takes place every year. That drafting contest means nothing, all right? For those of you who like to have fun with it, listen, there is nothing the same. There is nothing similar about drafting in a contest every year and drafting for an NFL football team every year. The biggest difference is with most of these contests, listen, they're fun. I love reading about them. I love competing in them. For most of these drafting contests, you're usually picking the top 100 players or the top first rounders, whatever like that. When you are part of an NFL team and you're the general manager, you get one first round pick a year, generally. You get one second round pick, you get one third. You get 7 picks a year on average. And the next season you have to do it all over again. And if you miss, you can't say, well, I hit 80% of my picks. If you're in a contest, you can say, hey, I hit on 80 or 90% of my picks. I did pretty good. When you're the general manager of an NFL team, you don't get that. You got one first round pick, 1 second, all the way down the line. You've got to be able to make those fifth rounders and those sixth rounders work as well. Can Mike Mayock do that? I don't know. I'm not the guy who can tell you whether or not he can do that. What I am here to tell you is the reason they pulled in Mike Mayock, and there's 2 of them, the biggest reason is they are getting what they think is a draft expert. Whether you like him or not, this is what they think they're getting. And that's going to be very important for what they're looking at the next 2 seasons. With all of these draft picks that they have the next 2 off seasons, they wanted somebody who they thought was a draft expert who could really make a difference when it comes to drafting. Is Mike Mayock that guy? I don't know. When you look at his picking versus what the Raiders did, and I've seen a couple articles on the internet comparing him to what the Dolphins did the past couple of seasons and his results, and what the Raiders have done the past few seasons and their results. The results are very similar. There's really not any great difference there. So I don't know if Mike Mayock can do this, but they brought him in to draft. If he doesn't do anything else correctly, they brought him in to draft. The second thing they brought him in to do was to work with John Gruden. Wasn't behind the scenes. I don't know if Reggie McKenzie and John Gruden were getting along or not. It would seem that they were not. But Mike Mayock is there to get along with John Gruden and to do basically whatever John Gruden asks of him. That's not an unsimilar power structure to what there is in New England with Bill Belichick. Whenever the personnel guys get in there, the general managers, they are there to do whatever Bill Belichick asks them to do, and that's what Mike Mayock is here for. John Gruden is the power guy here. He's the guy who has all the final say. He likes Mike Mayock. He's going to try to work together with him on the draft. Going forward, what the Raiders have to look for, that all depends on how Gruden can coach and on how Mayock can draft, just like every other team in the NFL. These are the assets. These are the player grades. We'll try to cover this some more, look at some of the stuff they're doing, get a little more in particular as the offseason moves on. Thank you for watching. I know this is a really long video. We will see you next time on Sports and Money. I am Benny Parker.